I leaned against the doorframe, my breath caught between sentences we never dared to finish. He stood across from me in the dim hallway, one step closer than last time, his voice still trembling from what he almost said. The sound of the ceiling fan buzzed overhead, mixing with the distant hum of cicadas outside. Neither of us moved, but the weight of everything unspoken swelled between us, pushing, pulling. Our eyes locked. It felt like the moment might crack open and swallow us both. His lips parted slightly. Mine trembled. Then, the front door slammed. My husband's voice cut through the silence like a jagged edge. "Where is everybody?" We froze. I stepped back. He blinked twice and turned away as if nothing had just almost happened. But something had. It had started days earlier, with the simplest of things. A favor. A look. A massage. Before I begin the story and tell you how everything really happened, answer this question: would you be able to forgive a loved one's betrayal? The air had been heavy that afternoon, thick with Andalusian summer heat that made everything feel more fragile. I stood in the kitchen fanning myself with a folded tourist brochure, half listening to the sports channel echoing from the living room, the other half thinking about the hours ahead. My husband would be leaving for a 2-day work trip. His suitcase sat by the door. The passport, charger, shaving kit, all lined up perfectly, as usual. Predictable. Perfectly boring. He kissed me on the cheek with the same absent-mindedness he used when closing a cabinet. "Don't forget the sprinkler guy's coming tomorrow," he said, grabbing his sunglasses. I nodded and muttered something about being fine on my own. He didn't hear it. The moment the car rolled out of the driveway, the silence felt different. Emptier. I stood there for a while, watching the dust settle in the sunlight that beamed across the tiles. Upstairs, I could hear movement. His son had returned from university for the summer and was staying in the guest room. We hadn't spoken much since he arrived, only the usual pleasantries over breakfast or while crossing paths in the hallway. There was something in the way he looked at me that felt almost too still, like a held breath. I told myself I was imagining it. Later that day, I found him out back struggling with the new irrigation timer. The sprinklers were bursting to life one by one across the lawn, and he was soaked to the knees, laughing. I stood at the edge of the porch with a towel and a smirk. "You're fighting a losing battle," I called out. He looked up, wiping sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. "I think this thing was designed to humiliate me." "You're doing a great job humiliating yourself." He walked up to the porch, water dripping down his arms. I handed him the towel, and for a moment, our fingers touched. Just lightly. But it felt uncomfortably natural. That evening, after a quiet dinner of leftover tortilla and olives, I found myself sitting on the edge of the couch, trying to stretch the knots out of my shoulders. I hadn't realized how stiff I'd become from lifting planters earlier that day. I tried pressing into the sore muscle myself, but it only made things worse. Then I heard his voice behind me. "Want help?" I turned halfway and saw him leaning on the wall, arms crossed. I hesitated. "It's just a massage," he added, as if he could already see the thought unraveling behind my eyes. I agreed before I could think of a reason not to. I sat on a stool near the dining table while he stood behind me. His hands were surprisingly firm, moving slowly, almost too gently at first. No words were exchanged. No music. No distractions. Just silence and fingertips working through my tension. The moments passed slowly, like warm honey. Then I stood up too quickly, muttered something about checking laundry, and left the room. My heart was pounding. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept playing it back, searching for something, anything, that would let me say it was nothing. But I wasn't sure anymore. The next morning came with golden light flooding the terrace. I sat sipping coffee, staring at the street. He passed behind me on the way to the garage and said nothing. I felt oddly disappointed. Later, while watering the plants, I lost my balance carrying a heavy ceramic pot. My back spasmed, a sharp pain ripping up my side. I cried out. He was by my side in an instant, grabbing the pot with one hand and steadying me with the other. I clung to his arm as the pain subsided, muttering thanks. You should let me take a look. You're tense again, he said quietly. This time I didn't resist. He set up a chair in the living room. The fan spun slowly overhead. The house was so quiet I could hear the ice crackling in the lemonade I had poured earlier. I sat, letting him press along my shoulder blades, down my spine. The same silence returned. Only this time it wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. I closed my eyes, unsure of what I was letting happen, or why I wasn't stopping it. He stopped suddenly. I turned around. He looked at me. I looked at him. And just like that, something shifted in the room. Like gravity tilting. Like two people suspended in a moment that shouldn't exist. Then the front door slammed. Where is everybody? My husband's voice rang out. We froze. I stepped back. The chair creaked. He turned away. My chest was a storm. But none of that compared to what came next. As I reached for my phone, still trying to steady my breath, I noticed something missing from the console table near the door. I walked over, looked twice, then 3 times. It was gone. My phone. And when I asked about it later that evening, just before dinner, he walked in with a calm expression and said, "Found it out by the garden. Must have slipped." But it hadn't. Because I never went near the garden. Not that day. Not once. And he knew that. I took the phone from his hand and forced a smile. Thanks, I said, as casually as I could manage. He just nodded and walked past me, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just returned something I never lost in the first place. Dinner was quiet. My husband barely looked up from his tablet, scrolling through work emails. The sound of cutlery scraping against ceramic filled the room. Across the table, the boy, no, the man who had been living under this roof again for only a few days, kept his eyes on his plate. I couldn't eat. Not really. I moved food from one side to the other until it was socially acceptable to stop pretending. Later, I stood under the shower, letting hot water hit the back of my neck. My mind raced through 100 timelines, why he had taken the phone, what he had seen, what he had wanted to see. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But something about the way he handed it back told me it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. And quiet. That was worse than confrontation. It meant he was playing a game I didn't know the rules to. The next morning brought more heat, more stillness, and more tension folded into the corners of every room. My husband had gone to the notary's office. I was alone again. Alone, except for him. I caught a glimpse of him from the kitchen window, messing with the irrigation system again, this time shirtless. His skin caught the light, tanned and taut from summer sports. I looked away fast, ashamed of how long I had stared. By the time I walked out with a cold drink in hand, he had already set up the hose to run along the garden beds. The smell of lavender and soil filled the air. He wiped his forehead with a towel. "Your back bothering you again?" he asked without turning. I hated that he noticed. I hated that I wanted him to notice. "A little," I said. He didn't answer. Just kept working. I sat in one of the wicker chairs under the awning, my glass sweating onto my fingers. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Then he said, "I could help again. If you wanted." I paused for half a second too long. Sure. He didn't come over immediately. He finished adjusting the hose, washed his hands at the spigot, dried them slowly. Only then did he walk over. There was nothing suggestive in his movements. Nothing inappropriate in his posture. Just calm, methodical presence. I sat still while he stood behind me. Again, no words. His hands moved across my shoulders with the same confidence and control as before. The pain in my muscles softened, gave way to something else. A kind of surrender I hadn't allowed myself in years. I closed my eyes. The fan above creaked gently. My breathing slowed. Then something shifted. Not in his touch, it stayed steady. But in me. Like the ground beneath had leaned just enough to notice. A second too long. A space too still. I stood abruptly, again. Thanks. That helped. He nodded and stepped back. I went inside and stayed there the rest of the day. That night, my husband mentioned leaving again, this time for 2 nights. A regional conference in Valencia. More meetings. More obligations. I encouraged him to go. I told him the break would be good. For both of us. He didn't seem to notice my tone. The morning he left, I felt both lighter and heavier. The air was humid. The windows were fogged slightly from the shift in pressure. I sat on the terrace, reading a book I wasn't really following. Around midday, he came outside. I'm going to grab lunch at the market. Want to come? I surprised myself by saying yes. We walked the short distance to the plaza, not speaking much along the way. The streets were lively, vendors selling pimentos, local cheese, tourists asking for directions in broken Spanish. We stopped for horchata. He offered me his first sip, and I accepted without hesitation. The way he looked at me changed then. Not overtly. Not even noticeably, maybe, to anyone else. But I saw it. We bought groceries, things we didn't really need. He insisted on churros, said they reminded him of Sundays as a kid. I laughed. Genuinely, I think. On the way back, our fingers brushed as we each reached for the same bag of produce. I pulled mine back immediately. He didn't say anything. Today you seem different, he said finally, as we neared the house. Maybe I am, I replied. After lunch, I tried to read again, but I couldn't concentrate. I watched the wall. The shadows. The way time bent and stretched when silence got too loud. Around 5, I found him on the upstairs balcony. He was looking out over the neighborhood, the rooftops painted in soft peach and orange by the sinking sun. I stepped outside and stood beside him. I thought you left, he said. I almost did. We didn't look at each other. Maybe I should go, he said, softly. I didn't respond. We stood still for what felt like hours compressed into seconds. Then, without a word more, we kissed. The wind picked up slightly. A neighbor's dog barked. The world kept turning, but I felt like I had stepped outside of it. I pulled away first. I didn't know why. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. Maybe both. He didn't protest. He just nodded once and walked back inside. I stayed out there for a long time. When I finally came in, it was dark. I passed by his room, door closed, and went into mine. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and tried to map out where I had crossed the line. Morning came too early and too bright. I avoided him. He didn't try to find me. But later, as I was loading laundry into the washing machine, I opened the lid and froze. There, crumpled between 2 towels, was the shirt he wore yesterday. And inside the shirt pocket, my bracelet. The one I had lost 2 days ago. The one I had searched the entire house for. The one I was convinced I had misplaced somewhere completely different. I hadn't even told anyone it was missing. I stared at it, turning it over in my hand, the small gold clasp I knew so well. It wasn't just about a kiss anymore. He had been in my room. And I hadn't even noticed. I stood there, staring at the bracelet in my palm, long after the machine had finished spinning. The house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that calms you. The kind that listens. Watches. Waits. I walked to my room with slow, deliberate steps, the bracelet clenched so tightly in my hand I could feel the small edges press into my skin. Every drawer in the room was closed. The bed was made. The windows locked. But somehow, he had been inside. I didn't know when. I didn't know why. All I knew was that something had changed, and I didn't understand what game we were playing anymore. Later that afternoon, I tried to act normal. I prepared lunch, set the table, poured water. My husband had sent a message earlier. He would be staying one more night in Valencia. Work dinner. I read it twice before deleting it. He wouldn't call. He never did. He came down from his room without a word, pulled out the chair across from me, and started eating. I didn't ask about the shirt. I didn't ask about the bracelet. I didn't ask why he couldn't meet my eyes. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answers. The silence between us was the loudest thing in the room. After lunch, I tried to retreat into the comfort of routine, cleaning the kitchen, wiping counters that didn't need wiping, organizing the spice rack. When I reached for the cinnamon jar, I noticed the faintest fingerprint smudge on the stainless steel handle of the upper cabinet. That shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. I spent the next hour pretending not to watch him. He read on the terrace, legs stretched across the wicker bench, completely relaxed. Too relaxed. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't taken something. Returned something. Been somewhere he shouldn't have been. By early evening, the temperature dropped slightly, and he offered to help bring the laundry in before the dew settled. We didn't speak, not really. Just moved together through the motions, folding shirts, shaking out towels, stacking sheets. At one point, we reached for the same pillowcase, and our hands touched. He didn't pull away. I did. That night, the weight of everything hovered in the air. I couldn't focus on the show playing in the background. I wasn't even sure which channel was on. I sat on the couch, legs tucked under me, barely blinking. At some point, I realized he was standing in the hallway, half lit by the wall sconce. Just watching me. Then he spoke. "I'm sorry." I said nothing. He stepped closer, slowly, testing the space, my silence, maybe even his own courage. Then he sat beside me. Not too close. But not far enough either. "About the bracelet," he said quietly. "I saw it on your dresser a few days ago. I thought it was broken. I don't know why I kept it." I turned to him. His eyes were steady. Unafraid. "That doesn't make any sense," I said. "I know." For a moment, I wanted to ask if anything did. If what we were doing, thinking, feeling, was going somewhere, or if it was just a spiral. But before I could form the words, they vanished into something else entirely. We kissed. There was no warning, no escalation. Just the sudden nearness of something inevitable. I pulled away first. Again. The silence this time was heavier. I left the room without looking back and locked my door behind me. I didn't sleep. The next morning, my husband returned. He hugged me like a colleague. Told me Valencia was humid, the food mediocre, the hotel noisy. I listened. I smiled. I nodded. I didn't hear a word. At lunch, all three of us sat around the table again. Him at the head, me on his right, and his son on his left. I poured water. Passed bread. Smiled politely. My husband made a joke about the neighbor's new car looking like a refrigerator on wheels. I laughed mechanically. The boy didn't. After lunch, my husband retreated to his study to catch up on emails. I washed the dishes, letting the hot water burn my fingers. I needed to feel something that made sense. In the living room, I heard the sound of footsteps pause and then retreat. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, my heart racing for reasons I didn't fully understand. That evening, as I passed through the hallway, I heard the creak of the guest room door closing behind him. I stood outside it for several seconds before walking away. The following day, we were all invited to a dinner at a family friend's house in the next town over. A casual evening. Wine, grilled food, chatter. My husband insisted we all go. I resisted. He pushed. I relented. The drive was long. He talked most of the way. I pretended to listen. From the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of the boy behind me. Eyes fixed on the road. Or maybe on me. The evening was pleasant. Too pleasant. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in months. My husband complimented it absently. Someone turned up old music, and couples danced on the patio. At one point, I found myself standing alone near the pool, wine in hand, watching the water ripple under the garden lights. I felt a presence beside me before I saw him. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. For a few minutes, we just stood there, staring at nothing. Then, quietly, he said, "You're pretending so well." I didn't answer. "We both are," he added. I turned to him, but before I could speak, a splash broke the silence. A group of kids had jumped into the pool behind us, screaming and laughing. I stepped back instinctively, and my heel caught the edge of the stone walkway. I stumbled. He reached for me. But it wasn't his hand that caught mine. It was my husband's. He had appeared out of nowhere, arm around my waist, holding me steady. His smile was casual. Too casual. "Careful," he said. "These shoes always mess with your balance." I smiled weakly, nodded, thanked him. He let go, looked between us, then turned and walked back toward the group. The boy stood still beside me, staring at the ground. We didn't speak for the rest of the evening. When we got home, the house felt foreign. My husband went straight to bed, tired from the drive. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink. I sat at the table. He appeared 10 minutes later. He stood in the doorway, watching me. Something was different. Tighter. He didn't say anything. He just placed a folded towel on the table. I stared at it. "I found this in your closet," he said. I didn't understand. Then he added, "It smells like his cologne." And walked away. I stared at the towel on the table, my heartbeat pounding in my throat. The smell of his cologne was unmistakable, subtle but sharp, the kind that lingered in fabrics long after the body had left them. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. My husband had already walked away, not waiting for a reaction, as if the gesture itself had said enough. I sat motionless, trapped in 1,000 spinning thoughts, unable to tell if what I felt was fear or guilt, or something worse. He hadn't accused me. He hadn't raised his voice or asked a single question. But the message was clear, he had seen the threads fray. And now, he was watching where they unraveled. The next morning, the air was cold. colder than usual for this time of year. The sky outside was soft gray, threatening rain. He was already dressed when I entered the kitchen, keys in hand. "Weekend in Toledo," he said casually, as if suggesting lunch. "I thought it'd be good for you. Clear your head." I opened my mouth, but he was already walking to the door. "Pack light. I'll book the hotel." And he left. Toledo. A city heavy with memory and silence. A city where centuries of secrets had seeped into its walls. It felt fitting, somehow, that I'd be returning there now, of all places. By noon I had thrown a few things into a bag and stood in the hallway, hesitating. He hadn't mentioned if his son would be joining. I didn't ask. I didn't want to. The car ride was quiet. He drove, eyes on the road, hands steady. I stared out the window, counting olive trees and trying not to remember the last time I had seen this same stretch of highway, with someone else in the passenger seat. The city emerged from the horizon slowly, its rooftops layered in dusty browns and pinks, the cathedral tower slicing through the sky like a needle. We arrived at the hotel just before sunset. It was an old place tucked near the river, with heavy wooden beams and iron keys that clanked when they turned. The kind of hotel where stories get buried in the furniture. He handed me one of the keys, nodded toward the elevator. "Separate rooms," he said. I didn't question it. That night we had dinner in the hotel's terrace restaurant, facing the Tagus. The wind picked up, sending small ripples across the tablecloth. We barely spoke. He ate quickly, sipped wine slowly, and avoided looking at me for longer than a second. When we returned upstairs, he said he wanted to get some air. I watched him disappear down the hallway and listened to his footsteps fade. I stood alone in my room for a long time. And then I left. I walked with no direction, letting instinct guide me through the narrow streets. I passed shuttered shops, small glowing windows, empty benches. The city was unusually quiet for a Saturday. Or maybe I had gone deaf to the world outside my thoughts. I turned a corner near the bridge and stopped. He was there. Sitting alone on a bench, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, looking out at the river. His shoulders rose when he heard my steps. He turned. Neither of us smiled. We stood a few feet apart. Not close. Not far. "Why are you here?" I asked. "I had to see you." I didn't respond. "I didn't know he was bringing you here," he added. I nodded, staring at the stones beneath our feet. "I didn't come because of that," he continued. "I came because I thought maybe you needed to be far away from everything. And I wanted to be close to that." Still, I said nothing. "I don't expect anything from you," he said. "Not now. Maybe not ever." And then we spent the night together. When I woke the next morning, the city was bathed in soft gold light. I reached across the bed without thinking, but he was gone. The room was empty, his side of the bed already cool. I sat up, searching for any sign that he had been there. A shirt, a note, a breath left in the air. Nothing. The clock on the nightstand read 7:14. I dressed quickly, heart racing without rhythm. I opened the door, peeked into the hallway. No one. I took the stairs, passing two cleaning women chatting in hushed voices. Outside, the street was damp with morning dew. I looked both ways and started walking, retracing last night's path. The bench by the river was empty. I kept walking. The cafes weren't open yet. I wandered until I reached the Plaza Zocodover, heart sinking with each step. I turned a corner. And there he was. With her. His arm around a girl. A young woman. Smiling, talking, pointing toward the cathedral like a tour guide. She wore his jacket. He hadn't seen me. I froze, halfway behind a pillar. My stomach twisted. I couldn't move. He leaned close to her, said something. She laughed. He kissed her cheek. Not hurried. Not apologetic. Natural. I stepped backward, my heel catching the uneven stone, nearly slipping. My breath caught in my chest. I turned and walked away, fast, not knowing where I was going. I didn't stop until I reached the hotel. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, burst into my room, and slammed the door. I stood in the center, hands trembling, not from betrayal, but from confusion. From the brutal, incomprehensible collision of reality and imagination. None of it had been real. Or maybe all of it had been. But only for me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the carpet pattern, trying to find a shape that made sense. Then I noticed the corner of the pillow on the floor. I reached down to pick it up, and underneath it, tucked almost carefully, was something folded. A photograph. Worn edges. Soft creases. Him, as a child. 8. 9. Standing beside a woman. Smiling. Arm around her waist. And on the back, written in neat blue ink. Para Mama. Con amore eterno. My hands shook. Because that woman in the photo was me. I couldn't move. The photograph sat in my hand like a piece of evidence I never wanted to find. The edges were soft, worn from years of folding, and the ink on the back had faded just enough to feel distant, but not enough to erase. I stared at the child in the image. I knew those eyes. I had looked into them every day for the past few weeks, but never like this. And the woman next to him. I didn't recognize her in the moment I first saw the photo. But now, as if the truth crawled through my spine, I knew. It was me. A younger version, from a summer I had locked away in my memory, from a time I refused to revisit. The hair was longer. The skin smoother. But it was me. How he had this, I didn't know. Why he had it, I didn't want to know. My breath quickened, but I forced myself to stay still. Panic would only make the picture blurrier. I needed clarity. I needed to understand. And I needed to get out of that hotel room before I collapsed into something I couldn't undo. I shoved the photograph into the pocket of my coat and left. I didn't see him again that morning. I avoided the plaza, avoided the river. I walked aimlessly through the stone streets of Toledo, trying to outrun the questions in my head. The ones that wrapped around every thought like vines. I didn't know where my husband was either, and I didn't care. By noon, I had packed my things and left the hotel without saying a word. The drive home was a blur. The landscape outside the window meant nothing. Just a motionless movie playing behind glass. When I reached the house, everything felt wrong, too still, too silent, too clean. I dropped my bag by the door and went straight to the laundry room. I opened the drawer where I kept old keepsakes, school portraits, birthday cards, dusty photo albums. I pulled them all out. It was there. An identical copy of the same photograph, buried inside a folder I hadn't opened in more than a decade. I hadn't even remembered it existed. The same child. The same summer. A day trip to a small village festival. I had been volunteering for a community project. He had been one of the kids in the group. That was all. That was supposed to be all. But now he was here. In my home. In my life. And he had carried this photo all these years. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the photo in my hand, a blanket draped around my shoulders, every light in the house turned off except for the one over the kitchen. At some point near dawn, I heard the front door open. He stepped in quietly, pausing when he saw me. We didn't speak. He stood there, watching me watch him, the silence between us heavier than ever before. Then he walked past me, up the stairs, and disappeared into his room. The next day, my husband announced we were going to spend the weekend at the family home near Valencia, an old vineyard his relatives had kept for generations. He said we needed space. Fresh air. Nature. We'll all go, he said. It'll be good. I said nothing. The drive down was stiff. 3 hours of silence occasionally interrupted by the GPS or passing traffic. The vineyard was beautiful in an old, forgotten kind of way, stone walls covered in ivy, a main house with antique shutters and a guest house across the lawn. The air smelled of earth and dry leaves. That evening, I sat on the back porch alone, watching the sun melt behind the hills. He came out quietly, holding 2 glasses of water. He placed one near me without a word and sat on the far end of the bench. I didn't look at him. You kept it all this time, I said. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. I did. Why? His voice was almost a whisper. Because it mattered to me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, the sky was too quiet. The vineyard too dark. I stayed in the main house while the guest house remained dark and empty. Or so I thought. Around midnight, I walked past the kitchen toward the patio and noticed a soft glow from the guest house window. I crossed the grass barefoot, heart tight in my chest. The door was open. I stepped in slowly. He was there, sitting at the desk. Writing. He turned when he saw me. I thought it would be easier if I stayed out here, he said. I nodded. I didn't know you remembered that summer. I never forgot it. We didn't speak for a long time after that. I wanted to ask more. But I didn't. I couldn't. The answers were too close. Instead, we kissed. The next morning, we returned to the house as if nothing had happened. My husband made coffee, humming as he moved through the kitchen. He asked about the weather. Talked about harvesting. The boy avoided eye contact. I did the same. On the drive home, the silence had returned. Thick. Sharp. Unbreakable. That night, I went to bed early. I needed the world to stop spinning. I needed air. Sleep. Nothingness. But when I woke in the middle of the night, the house felt strange. I reached for my robe, padded out into the hallway. I could hear the soft thud of movement downstairs. I followed it. In the living room, I found him. Packing. A small duffel bag sat open on the floor. Clothes folded with quiet care. A book. A passport. I stood in the doorway. You're leaving, I said. He turned slowly. I have to. Why? His eyes were steady. Because I thought I could control it. But I can't. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. He walked over, placed something in my hand. It was a folded piece of paper. I never showed this to anyone. I wasn't sure if I ever would. Then he left. I opened the note. It wasn't a letter. It was a boarding pass. From 3 months ago. A flight from Madrid to Toledo. One way. Issued under my husband's name. Dated 2 days before the boy ever came home. And on the back. In my husband's handwriting. A single line. Let's see what she chooses. I stood in the living room for what felt like hours, gripping the boarding pass as if it could answer all the questions exploding inside my chest. The paper was soft from folding, almost delicate, but the implications were anything but. 3 months ago. 2 days before he returned home. My husband had booked that flight himself, under his own name. A one-way ticket to Toledo. And the words scribbled on the back, too neat to be rushed, too casual to be innocent, let's see what she chooses. I sank slowly into the nearest chair, numb to the dim lamplight spilling across the hardwood floor. It didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a test I had already failed before I even knew I was being tested. And suddenly everything, the timing, the silence, the tension, began to rearrange itself like a puzzle I hadn't realized was missing pieces. The boy didn't come down for breakfast. Neither did my husband. I sat alone at the kitchen table, untouched toast growing cold beside a half-empty mug of coffee. The house felt like a set built for a play that had ended weeks ago, and no one had remembered to tear it down. By midday, my husband emerged from his study dressed sharply in dark jeans and a linen shirt I hadn't seen in months. He moved deliberately, checking his watch, adjusting his sleeves. There was something rehearsed in the way he carried himself. He looked across the kitchen at me, his tone casual. "We've got guests coming tonight," he said. "An old colleague and his daughter. I want everything ready by 6. I blinked at him. "What guests?" "Don't worry. I've handled the food. Just make sure things look presentable." And then he walked back out without waiting for a response. I spent the afternoon pretending. Cleaning what didn't need cleaning. Arranging flowers that were already arranged. Reheating food I hadn't cooked. The boy never appeared, and I didn't go looking for him. At exactly 6, the doorbell rang. My husband greeted them with open arms and the voice of a man who hadn't just orchestrated the emotional demolition of our lives. I hovered behind, watching as he ushered in a man around his age, tan, loud, slightly overconfident, and a girl no older than 23. Her hair was long and pinned neatly, her voice soft, almost calculated. "This is her first time visiting this part of Spain," my husband said. I told her she had to see what a real household looks like. The girl smiled at me, and I returned a polite nod. I had no idea who she was. I didn't ask. We sat down for drinks in the garden, the last of the sun warming the terracotta tiles. The conversation was light, filled with name-dropping and vague stories about old projects and mutual friends. I barely listened. I kept looking up at the guesthouse window across the yard, wondering if he was still there. If he knew what was happening. The girl laughed at one of my husband's jokes and brushed her hair behind her ear with slow precision. She looked at him with too much interest. He didn't look away. When dinner was served, he made sure to place her next to him. I sat opposite, pretending to smile through every bite. The wine kept flowing, too easily. The girl spoke more now, about her travels, her work, her family. Her voice was melodic, but I couldn't focus on the words. Every time she touched her glass, her fingers brushed against my husband's. He didn't flinch. At some point, I realized I was gripping my fork too tightly. I placed it down. After dessert, the girl excused herself to use the bathroom. My husband turned to his friend. "So," he said casually, "we're thinking of inviting her to stay a few weeks. Just to get a feel for the area. She could use a change of pace." The man chuckled, swirling the last of his wine. "You sure you can handle the distraction?" My husband smiled, nodded at me. "I think it'll be good for all of us." The girl returned moments later, and my husband stood, announcing he'd show her the guest house, so she knows where she'll be staying. The words fell like bricks. I sat motionless as they walked out of the room together. I waited exactly 5 minutes before rising from the table. I moved through the house on instinct, toward the guest house, across the dim lawn. I reached the door and paused. I didn't knock. When I pushed it open, the lights were off. The space was empty. Silent. I stepped inside, confused, then startled as the light flicked on behind me. He was standing there. Not the girl. Him. The boy. "I knew you'd come," he said. I didn't speak. "They didn't come here," he added. "Your husband walked her down the side garden and sent her off in a cab." I turned to face him, confused. Why would he? He stepped forward, handing me a folded sheet of paper. "He left it on my bed," he said. "This morning." I opened it. It was a letter. Typed. Cold. Direct. In it, my husband laid everything out. The timeline. The decisions. The reasons. He had known long before I ever suspected. He had brought the boy home on purpose. To test something. To confirm what he had already believed to be true. He'd calculated each step, when to leave, when to return, when to observe. But the final paragraph was the one that chilled me. "There's no need for confrontation. I just needed to be right. And now that I am, I'm free to leave without guilt. You'll find the papers in the drawer by the bed. Do with them what you will." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. "He's gone," the boy said quietly. I looked at him, not fully processing the words. "He left an hour ago. Bags packed. Flight to Lisbon. Said he needed to disappear before it all turned to ash." I sank onto the edge of the bed, the paper still in my hand, the room spinning. He sat beside me. And we both sat there. Silent. As the last of the daylight faded from the window. I didn't move from that bed for a long time. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was dense, layered with a dozen broken truths neither of us could say out loud. He didn't reach for me. I didn't turn to him. We just sat there, together but splintered, in the room my husband had chosen for us long before we knew we'd end up here. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff. I walked to the small window and looked out across the garden. The lights in the main house were off. Everything looked frozen in amber, like the night was holding its breath. I turned to him. "He's really gone?" He nodded once. He took the taxi that brought the girl. Left before dinner even started. I wanted to ask why, but the answer was already written into everything he had done, the photos, the ticket, the setup with the girl. He hadn't been trying to catch me. He'd been trying to watch me choose. And I had. The following morning, the air had shifted. It was quieter, but not in a peaceful way. More like something had been hollowed out of the space between walls. I packed slowly. I didn't know why. There wasn't anywhere else I needed to be, but staying in that house felt wrong now, like sleeping in a stranger's bed after he's burned your name into the mattress. We drove back to the city without music. I watched the trees blur past and tried not to imagine what would happen next. No one called. No one waited. The world didn't collapse. It just moved on like it didn't even notice. Back home, the keys still worked. His things were gone. A few drawers left open. A gap in the bookshelf where he used to keep old travel guides. I walked through the rooms like I was cataloging absence. By evening, I couldn't sit still. I made dinner but didn't eat it. I set the table but didn't light the candles. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror for far too long. I didn't recognize the version of myself staring back. Not older. Not broken. Just different. Like something fundamental had cracked and shifted, leaving behind someone who looked the same but wasn't. He knocked on the kitchen door. Not loud. Just once. I opened it without asking who it was. I already knew. He stood there with a small backpack and a change of clothes. He looked like he was about to say something, but then didn't. He stepped inside, and I stepped aside. We didn't go upstairs. We sat in the living room. And we spent the night together. In the morning, the sun poured in through the windows as if nothing had changed. I made coffee. He stood at the sink. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was the only way it could exist at all. He stayed. Not permanently. Not loudly. He moved into the guest room. We told ourselves it was temporary. That we needed time. That we weren't defining anything yet. But something was shifting. We spent our days doing the kinds of things couples do when they're pretending not to be a couple. Groceries. Walks. Quiet breakfasts. Shared glances during lazy afternoons. I didn't ask him what he wanted from this. I think we both knew we didn't know. Then one day, it changed. It was late afternoon. We had just returned from the market. I was placing apples in the bowl near the sink when I saw the envelope on the counter. White. Unmarked. I opened it instinctively. Inside was a photograph. Printed. Fresh. Taken recently. It was the two of us, me and him, seated outside the cafe near the plaza, sharing a drink, mid-conversation. I remembered that afternoon. I remembered laughing. I remembered feeling, for the first time, something close to calm. But I hadn't seen anyone with a camera. There was no note inside. Just the photo. I turned around, held it out. Did you do this? He looked at it and shook his head slowly. No. You're sure? I wouldn't do that. The way he said it, confident, without hesitation, made me believe him. I put the photo down and walked to the back door. The air felt wrong again. As if the house had shifted slightly on its foundation. On the desk, a folder sat in the center. Not tucked away, not hidden. Just waiting. I didn't want to open it. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A legal document. Property transfer agreement. The house. His name removed. Mine left alone. No conditions. No lawyer stamps. Just his signature at the bottom. And beneath the document, a handwritten page. I didn't want to read it. But I did. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a list. Of dates. 17 of them. All spread over the last 5 years. Next to each one, a short note. You stopped talking at dinner. You forgot our anniversary. You left the window open in December. You looked at him differently that day. The last one, you closed the door behind you and never looked back. I couldn't breathe. I sat in his chair, the paper resting on my lap, and stared at the wall until my vision blurred. It hadn't started here. Not with the kiss. Not with the night. Not even with the photo. He had been watching me leave him long before I knew I was leaving. And maybe that was what haunted me more than anything, how easy I had made it for him to disappear. How quiet the unraveling had been. I heard movement in the hallway. He was still standing there, waiting. I folded the letter, placed it back in the folder, and closed it. When I stepped out, I didn't say anything. Neither did he. The next few days passed strangely. No big conversations. No decisions. Just a new kind of stillness. He stayed. I stayed. The air shifted around us, but we didn't. Not yet. Then the invitation arrived. A white envelope. Hand-delivered. No return address. Inside, a printed invitation card. My name in black letters. An art exhibition. In Valencia. His name, my husband's, listed as one of the featured patrons. Opening night, this Saturday. I read it twice, then showed him. He didn't react. He wants you to come, he said. Why? I don't know. But we both did. He was drawing a line. Inviting me to cross it. Or not. We left the next afternoon. The gallery was in the historic district, tucked between two narrow buildings with black window frames and ivy climbing the stone walls. People in pressed clothes stood outside, sipping wine and chatting in clusters. I didn't recognize anyone. Inside, the air was crisp and sterile. White walls. Soft lighting. Sparse music playing low, like an afterthought. We moved from piece to piece, pretending to observe. My eyes scanned the room. Then I saw it. A photograph. Mounted on the back wall, larger than the rest. Me. Taken from behind. Standing at our kitchen sink, bathed in late afternoon light. Title beneath it, The Pause Before Collapse. My breath caught. He appeared beside me before I heard him. My husband. In a navy blazer, no tie, holding a glass of white wine like nothing had ever changed. He didn't look at me first. He looked at him. Then he said, flatly, I see you brought him. I didn't answer. He turned to me. I never wanted to ruin you. You did that by waiting. He placed his empty glass on the ledge beside the frame and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without looking back. We left the gallery in silence. We didn't go back to the hotel. We didn't speak during the drive home. The next morning, I found the guest room empty. His backpack. His jacket. His sketchbook gone. Only one thing was left behind. On the dining room table, folded neatly beside the breakfast plate I hadn't touched. My own photo. The one from the gallery. And on the back, in his handwriting. You never saw me. Only what you needed me to be.